All right, guys. Well, welcome to Russian English Sermon Interpretation course. So this I'm excited to do this again. Last time we did it was 2016, and actually I wish we recorded the video back then. And I figured this time around I'll just I'll just record the video to make it easier. I think this is going to be kind of the story here for this class, with everyone being busy. Half the people won't be able to make it half the time. I will actually encourage you to come in person, because the way this class is going to be broken down, we're going to be here for about 8 to 9 times. I'll have to see how you're progressing, whether we need those 2 additional times.
We're going to need more. We're 4 years behind your last class in this kind of translation or this dual language. So,
Well, being in class here gives you a benefit of, we're going to do a lot of sort of on the stage practice, at the pulpit. So you come out and we'll do a couple minutes practice, and then we all provide constructive criticism, what you could have done better, and so on. So let me quickly just go over the syllabus here. So it's really designed as an introduction to the theory and practice of interpretation of biblical messages in church and other relevant events, both from Russian to English and English to Russian. Of course, most of you probably have much easier time going from Russian to English, which is, I'm finding that some people specialize in one or the other, but it's fine. But we'll be practicing both. Interpretation course is designed to significantly improve interpretation skills for both beginning and seasoned Russian English interpreters. This intensive 2 months course will focus on the following areas of growth and improvement: memorization of commonly used biblical passages in both languages. Students will be expected to commit to memory and quickly recite large passages in both languages. Just warning you, your Bible knowledge will improve dramatically, even though that's not the point. But memorization of commonly misinterpreted biblical terms, proper interpretation techniques of common idioms and sayings. This course will consist of theoretical in-class training as well as abundant skill development and homework exercises. Students will also be assigned memorization homework every week. All students, regardless of skill level, should expect to experience significant improvement. And I've seen it 4 years ago when we did this. I've seen people who could not interpret at all. They would get up here and to go from being able to do a half-decent job. So I was actually surprised how fast it takes to build those skills. I was shocked myself. So at least 50% improvement from where you are now. And pace of conveying spoken sermons and messages between the 2 languages. Improvement in understanding the biblical text and insight into revelatory meaning of common scriptures. Because you'll be memorizing scriptures, you'll actually get to understand those critical scriptures better. Improvement in prayer and studying in scriptures discipline. Again, that wasn't the point of it, but that seems to be the side effect. And significant improvement in cognitive and operating memory skills. So we're going to be doing some exercises that teach you to listen and speak at the same time, and do the opposite. For example, we'll do some exercises where you're writing out numbers 1 to 100, but saying them 100 to 1. I mean, but writing, you're writing them, but saying the opposite order. So that helps your mind to kind of do 2 things at once. So we're going to be meeting every Wednesday through the end of April. This is about 10 times. And then there will be final exam. And the final exam will consist both of the written part, where it's like a test. Part of it is going to be rewrite the scripture. Here's the scripture, write it out, and in both languages. There's going to be a lot of true and false in there, based on the theory we'll study. And there will be also the actual test where you're going to listen to the passage, or to the sermon, and interpret, record the interpretation of yourself. So both consecutive and simultaneous. I'm going to go through all of that. So let me just activities and skills on page 2. So you will acquire the following skills through a variety of classroom techniques and practical activities: practical knowledge of basic modes of spoken interpretation, consecutive and simultaneous, general understanding of abilities, knowledge, and role of the interpreter in church setting, and ability to render interpretation of a variety of biblical texts from Russian into English and vice versa, and understanding of the technology resources and options available to interpreters and translators, and understanding of ethics of profession of interpreting. As you know, this is actually a big profession in the world, the interpreting, and so I took some college courses on this, on interpretation and translation. So it was interesting to learn how much this is a big thing in politics, obviously, UN and all that. So I expect you to come weekly, and the ability for you to really develop interpretation skill is directly proportional to your attendance in class. That's what I noticed. People who didn't come, they really didn't grow as much. People who came all the time and participated, they really grew. So this is not a class where you're earning a grade. This is a class where you're really striving to become a good interpreter. So you gave me the email addresses for Google Drive. I will invite you to the class folder on Google Drive. All of this, all the class materials, everything I'm handing today is there. All the homework assignments are there. And also your homework submissions. One of your homework submissions is to, every week you'll be given 5-minute segment of sermon, and you need to interpret that on audio and submit that through Google Drive so I can listen to it. And that enables me, and having not that many people is great because I can actually listen to all of them, and when we come to next class, I can do constructive criticism or critique of, you've done this well, and then some words were not used. I mean, it's a good learning experience for you're getting a feedback on how you're, and I'll tell you in the next 10 weeks you'll see yourself dramatically improving. This would be interesting. So you don't really bring positive attitude, pen and pencil if you want to. You can also bring phone or whatever to write with, to take notes if you want to, because there will be a test. And some people last time chose to bring binder with 3 sections. Here's my class materials, here's homework, and here's like reference materials. So raise your hand if you ask questions. I don't like to be doing seminars. I prefer for you to just ask questions and just interrupt anytime you feel like it. Make sure your phones are off. Whenever others are interpreting, offer constructive criticism. Don't try to demolish them, which it's not helpful. Everyone is learning. And then everyone participates. I would appreciate anything. In fact, I'll be calling on people. You're next. So everyone will have a chance to participate. Anyway, so, and then the final grade is attendance and participation 20%, memorization homework 20%, interpretation assignments 30%, final exam 30%. So there will be a certificate given at the end, and so the last time I did it, I broke the certificates into 2 sections. People who I thought were ready to go on stage and church and interpreter got, I forget what I called it. So they have one sort of a certificate, and people who graduated got a passing grade, because passing grade is really judged by your improvement, not by your level of being able to interpret. So everyone's passing grade would be different. For the written score, it's all the same, but when you're actually recording your own voice and interpreting and all that, I'm going to be judging it based on from where you started on your homework 1 to where you are 10 weeks later.
Don't try too hard on
All right. So let me give you a few things here as well. So these are the lists of scriptures to memorize in the next 10 weeks. And those are very commonly used. I found the ones that have a lot of sort of a diversity of words. And here's a list of commonly misinterpreted Russian and English terms, and it tells you which ones you have to kind of memorize for which week. I think it runs out on week 7. Okay. All right. So any questions so far? All right. Awesome. So what gives me the right to be here and teach interpretation? I started interpreting my very, very first message. I remember a pastor from Ukraine came, and I really, really wanted to interpret. I was 15 years old, and there's no one found to interpret him at an American church. And well, I went up and interpreted him on the stage. It was nerve-wracking, but I enjoyed it. And I'm turning 40 this year, so it's been exactly 25 years since I stepped in the minefield of interpretation. I call it my hobby more so than a ministry, even though my wife says she doesn't like when I call it a hobby, because she's like, do you realize how much sacrifice it is for me when you're not with me to interpret? Don't steal my reward. It's a ministry. I want to get my reward. So it is a ministry for sure. And I've interpreted not just in church setting, I've also interpreted a lot in private meetings, interpreted conferences, events like that. And I've interpreted in booths, doing a lot of simultaneous here at church, but also conferences as well. When I was going to Penn State, I took a Russian English translation course taught by an instructor who was not a Russian speaker, and he spoke, I think, 6 languages. And it was interesting because most of the students there were not Russian speakers, but this was senior level Russian translation course, so everyone there was able to speak Russian. So they could carry out conversational Russian. There's only 2 people who were native Russian speakers, me and another person. And the instructor said, don't worry guys, it's going to be fair because these guys speak much better English than you do. So after that, I was looking for every opportunity to correct the instructor when he incorrectly pronounced the word, or he misinterpreted something or mistranslated something in the text. I remember we were reading a play. It was a Russian play, and we had to read it in Russian. And then people were asking questions, what does that word mean? What does that word mean? And there was one, it was assigned for homework, and the next class, the students came in, and they asked, what does nachnushka mean? Nachnushka. What does that mean? He goes, well, this is kind of like nighty-night. It's sort of like a soft way to call the night. I said, no way. This is nightgown. This is not anything but night. He goes, no. This is definitely not nightgown. And I sit there. I'm like, come on, it's a nightgown. What are you talking about? So, and then we're reading the next passage, and right there it says, «И она с радостью выбежала его встречать в ночнушке». And I go, yes, vindicated. And the professor kind of looked above his glasses, didn't say anything, kept on continuing the course. So anyway, it just had some fun with it. But they made us translate like Russian poetry into English, and also English poetry into Russian. We had to maintain the rhythm, the rhyme. It was pretty intense in some ways, but it was a lot of fun. But also they taught us, they made us do research and write papers about the professional career of interpretation and translation, and then study the techniques, so it was actually a lot of good information that I learned from the professional interpretation environment. All right, so let's keep on going. All right, so lesson 1. And then, of course, this stuff could be applied, most of the theory here could be applied to other languages. It's not just Russian and English, but I'm going to focus, obviously, around Russian and English. So do you guys know the difference between interpretation and translation? Does that mean the same thing? What is it?
I'd say interpretation is like understanding what it truly means, not just the words by themselves, but in the context. And translation is just turning them into the other language, more vaguely without context.
Well, so interpretation is translating, is sort of rendering, interpreting the context, like going into deeper meaning versus just. Well, so the word interpretation, if you're interpreting the text, it's kind of like reading between the lines and all that. But in the context of going from one language to another, it's something a little different.
Translation's like word for word, just like point blank. Okay.
Most people don't know, actually, if you ask them. So, very simple. Translation is rendering the original text in target language that's in writing.
Okay.
So this is your books, translating letters, documents, manuals, and all that. This is all written text. Interpretation is basically spoken translation. So it's when there's a speaker and someone verbalizes what they're saying in the target from the language of origin into the target language. So what we're doing today is it's an interpretation course. We're not studying translation at all. Translation is a completely different ballgame. In fact, I think Google Translate made that profession pretty much obsolete anymore. And pretty soon the AI is going to make interpretation obsolete, maybe. In fact, whenever I have to translate text from one language to another, I throw that into Google Translate, and I just edit it a little bit on the end. Bam! It's really, really fast. Makes me sound very professional. I used to do it manually, and it took a long time to translate a couple-page letter. Now it really takes me 10 minutes, and 3 pages are done. So we're not studying translation at all. It's a sort of completely different ballgame. The expectations for quality in translations are much higher because you have the time. In interpretation, there's a lot more forgiveness. It's a lot more thinking on your feet, and that makes. I don't like translation. I love interpretation. It's a lot more fun in that sense.
Depends on the audience, right?
Correct. It's actually more fun when the audience, barely anyone, understands the language of origin, because then no one is sitting there and correcting you.
Right.
So in our church, it's you have to be on your toes more. But at the same time, I actually learned to appreciate the fact that people can listen, and most of them can understand both languages. People yell out words to help you sometimes. So it's been helpful.
You realize, why do we need a translator?
Apparently, there are enough people who don't speak both.
Yeah.
All right. So the rules of interpretation. When you interpret a speaker, is your job to interpret them word to word, or just summarize what they were saying?
Word for word.
Okay, maybe it's not a fair question. The challenge is this. if you're translating or interpreting, see, I misspoke again. If you're interpreting the English or Russian speech word for word in English, you have to follow the original language as closely as possible, but there's a lot of idioms. You can't translate idioms word for word. They could be meaningless in the target language. You could be saying stuff in English that there's tons of sayings in both language, and you can't really say it word for word. Sometimes in Russian language, and we're going to get to the differences between these two languages, but you could have, or in English language, there's a lot of ambiguous type verbs, and if you're interpreting word for word, you can really go off the deep end and really misinterpret the speaker. So you're not supposed to summarize. I've seen this happen. I've seen people say, the speaker goes for 5 minutes and they use 30 seconds to just convey what the summary was. They missed a lot of emotion. They missed a lot of adjectives. When preacher speaks and they really want to go hardcore and they really want to convey the message, they use a lot of adjectives. They load up, they try to really use a lot of synonyms, so people really understand the message. And Jesus Christ can raise you from the dead. He can lift you up. He can recover, restore. And you can translate, Иисус Христос может тебя воскресить и восстановить. See, you totally lost the emotion of the whole speech because you just summarized. And people are listening and they're like, so you have to be listening to those adjectives and synonyms very clearly and try to use synonyms when you're interpreting, because you can lose the kind of the emotion of the message. People will kind of understand what it's been talked about, but they'll miss 90% of the message. Never use third person translate or third person pronouns. Like, don't do and he said. So you always say I. All right, when you're interpreting, it's very unnatural at first. So when the speaker comes out and speaks, and you go, for example, the speaker says, brothers and sisters, it's been an exciting time. My wife and I came here, and my kids, they're all there. Say hello. We're privileged to be in your church. As a speaker, as an interpreter, it kind of sounds odd to say, my wife and my kids and hello, because what you have to think of, you're lending your voice to the speaker, okay? It's in a way, it's acting, okay? The speaker is the speaker, you're lending your voice, you're lending your capacity, and you're trying to say exactly what he says in the target language. And you don't add yourself to it, you're not the one who speaks. Sometimes I've been in situations when the speaker says things that I theologically disagree with. Okay? And it's very, very, very tempting to start making corrections. Very tempting. Because you think, oh my gosh, and those are the hardest messages to interpret, because you're standing there and you're like, man, this is just not right. And you're arguing in your mind with their theology. But that's not your place. This is the point. People who are sitting listening, they're not dumb, okay? They're the ones who are supposed to process it. And of course, they're pastors, whoever is running the meeting. It's their responsibility maybe at the end to correct the wrong theology. It's not yours as an interpreter. So don't try to be, especially if the speaker understands both languages, they're kind of listening to you as well. So don't try to, it's not your job responsibility to correct theology. So use the words as close as possible. Stick to the original text as close as possible. Say exactly what the speaker said. I'll always use the first person pronoun. When the speaker is using first person, never say, he said, his wife and kids are there. they're waving to you right now. Don't do that. It's so hard to anyone who does it it's just tough. Your job as an interpreter is to try to match the emotion of the speaker as close as possible. As a preacher, when you preach, and obviously I'm a preacher as well, when you preach and you're being interpreted, and interpreter is on a totally different wavelength emotionally than you are, it's very, very hard to preach. It's actually very hard to listen to when the speaker is being very, very emotional. Like, brothers and sisters, we have a great I am. The Lord of hosts is here. He's here upon us. And the speaker, братья и сестры, у нас есть великолепный Господь. Он есть сущий, Он среди нас, Он любит нас. Or because, and the reason interpreters do this is because they're so focused on the words that they're not paying attention to their voice. Or if the speaker goes really, really quiet, and today, the Lord is speaking to you right now. Just listen to the voice of Holy Spirit. And the interpreter goes, «И Господь говорит тебе, слушай голос Духа Святого». It breaks. See, you're supposed to be sort of in sync with the speaker, and you are disrupting the message. I think the rule that I use for myself is, I, as the interpreter, have to become as invisible to the audience as possible. Subconsciously, they have to forget I exist. Subconsciously, I have to get lost as much as possible as an interpreter, not to be in speaker's way. And that's the problem. Interpreters sometimes get in speaker's way so much, then the poor preacher is trying to focus on his message, yet he's like, what is going on over here? So don't get in speaker's way by just not being in sync emotionally with the speaker. Another rule is never look at a speaker. I see this, people do this all the time. And we're going to cover some of more of this in a consecutive interpretation class. I think it's going to be class 3. 2 or 3. I have to remember which one. So there's going to be a lot of rules of how to act and behave on the stage and all that. But don't do this. When let's say the speaker is here and here you are.
That happened last Sunday a little bit.
And then you start interpreting, okay? Use your peripheral vision, okay? Watch what the speaker is doing with your peripheral vision, but look at the audience. It is hard at first. It's really hard because the natural thing to do is turn to them. Yeah. But what happens is when you turn to the speaker, the speaker's peripheral vision activates and says, someone is looking at you. They look and start preaching to you. And if it's like, listen, they keep on going. But then I notice sometimes when an interpreter does intently look at the speaker all the time, the speaker constantly looks at them, and sometimes at the audience. So the interpreter just disrupted the speaker's message by constantly looking at the speaker. So when you're standing and listening, you're always just kind of like focus here. Or if you're standing to the left of the speaker, focus on your peripheral vision. But look at the audience straight. And it makes a lot of difference. You're not disrupting in fact, some speakers got so used to preaching with interpreters who look at them. I've caught, like when I interpret at conferences with some new people, that they're preaching and they're looking at me, but they notice that I'm not looking at them at all. Like I would look at them and look away. After about 2 or 3 phrases, they forget I exist. And then they really preach to the audience. And once they forget I exist, the message goes really, really good, really smooth. Part of the challenge when you're interpreting is being able to catch the rhythm with the speaker. Okay, there is no hard rule about do you let them finish the whole sentence, or do you just go word like 2-3 words and then you interpret. A lot of your professional interpretation courses that I look through, they always say, always finish the sentence. Let the speaker finish the sentence, then you finish the sentence. Well, maybe in a sort of a professional seminar, medical seminar setting, that works. In church preaching setting, when speakers can get really emotional and start speaking fast, this whole let them finish the sentence, you can throw that out the window. The rule that I use is I try to catch the rhythm with the speaker. And it's your job as an interpreter to pace the speaker, not the speaker's job. As far as and I'll cover that in consecutive interpretation course in more detail. We'll talk about that. Actually, one of you will be on the stage and we'll be practicing it. But developing a rhythm, like once you catch a rhythm, sometimes you go through half of the message until you finally catch a rhythm with the speaker. And you can see if you caught the rhythm because the audience stops looking at you. As soon as you catch the rhythm with the speaker, you notice people are like sitting, listening to a speaker and looking at the speaker, don't even mind. Like they stopped noticing that you exist. I'm talking about most of the people. So you can see it by audience reaction that you caught the rhythm with the speaker because you disappeared subconsciously from their view. And sometimes you never catch a rhythm, the whole message, and those are the really rough ones. And then people will come up to you at the end and say, yeah, you had a rough day today. And they can explain why, but you just never caught a rhythm. It's like sometimes they speak short sentences, sometimes long sentences, sometimes they go for 3-4 sentences, forget to interpret. And if you didn't catch the rhythm, don't blame the speaker. You screwed up. It's your responsibility to catch the rhythm with the speaker, not speakers. Speakers' responsibility to preach the word. That's what they're there for. They're not supposed to account for you as an interpreter. It's your job. And I will talk about how to pace the speaker and forcing pauses and all that. It's your job to make pauses happen, not the speaker's job. Like I said, that's consecutive interpretation class. All right, technology use and requirements. So we talked about that. This is for class technology use. Yeah. So everything we're doing here is going to be on YouTube video. I haven't decided whether it's going to be one of those. You can do YouTube video 2 ways. You can have YouTube video that's not searchable, that you have to have the actual link to be able to open it, or you can do the ones that is going to be on the channel. I have a channel called Anchored in Truth. I only have like 1 video on there that has 4 views. I started it a few years back and I don't use it, so I might as well use that channel. Maybe I'll have it on the channel. I don't know, but I'll give you links at the very least. You'll find those links in lesson notes. A lot of these notes will be available on Google Drive as well, so then you can watch the video. All right, differences between Russian and English language. Okay, what are some of the differences that you know or can think of?
Both written and spoken, or just like in language in general? I mean the writing, like reading Russian, you can't read Russian if you don't know what's it called?
The alphabet?
Yeah. Well, yeah, or that type of alphabet system.
Well, let's talk more specifically as it relates to interpretation. So, English is an analytical language. Russian is a synthetic language. So, that makes Russian in some ways more flexible. So in English, sentences are more structured. In Russian, sentences you could still, as you're interpreting, you can modify your sentence and add sentence modifiers and things like that at the end. English is a more condensed language. That's why it's a lot easier for me to interpret into English than into Russian. And I speak both equally well. I mean, I don't know if I can say my Russian pronunciation is better because it's my native language, but as far as my vocab and the thoughts that I can express, depends on the topic. I can either express it better in Russian or in English, but I think on average it's about the same. Even with that, it's a lot easier for me to interpret into English. In fact, the rules for interpretation, when UN interpreters interpret, they always have to interpret from their native language to the target language. They never, and they do sometimes, but they prefer that the interpreter interprets from their native spoken language to the whatever target language they're interpreting to, not the other way around. Because in interpretation, they want to prefer that you fully understood the whole thing that the speaker is saying. It's very important to understand what the speaker is saying. If you don't know some words, it's very hard to interpret them properly. So, because there's so many subliminal messages, so many read between the lines, in so many maybe jokes that you have to be a native speaker of that language to really understand. So even in professional environment, you go from native to non-native language. But I think if you compare Russian and English, things are just shorter in English. You can say it a lot faster than you can say it in Russian. English has more implicit meanings of terms, kind of like reading between the lines. That's because there's a lot of words that mean different things but sound the same. Russian is more direct. English is more metaphoric. Again, there's a lot more reading between the lines in English, which means when you listen to something in Russian, it's kind of easier to grasp the meaning right away. In English, sometimes you have to think about what are they really trying to say. English language likes generalizations. Russian is intolerant of generalizations. What do I mean by that? So, name me a Russian verb for verb go. That's walk. Davai is more like come on. What is a Russian verb for go? To go. To my best understanding, there is none. Okay? So, in English, you can say, and we went to church. In Russian, you have to know how you. Did you walk to church? Did you fly to church? Did you drive to church? You have to be very specific because go describes a movement, a motion. Okay? So, when you're going from English to Russian, and the speaker says, and we went to the moon. You can't say, и мы пошли на Луну. That makes no sense. Okay? You gotta say, okay, well, if it's the moon, they couldn't walk. Rule that out. They couldn't really drive. Rule that out. So you're doing the process of elimination in your mind while the speaker is already on to the next thing. And you gotta come up with the best verb that can tell you, oh, мы полетели на Луну. So, English is like that in so many different verbs, like the verb get. What does the meaning of the word get?
In Russian?
Yeah. To get. Well, it depends on what follows the word get. If you say get out, взял makes no sense whatsoever, right? If you say get in, or how about verb put, to put? I love how my kids say, поставь одежду, or something like that. It's like, put on your clothes. No, не поставь одежду, оденься. So, so these general terms, and they're very, very helpful when you're going from Russian to English. Because if you can't think of a specific way, of a specific word, a verb, you can always use the get, put, and go with like, I don't know what these additional words are called, up, down, in, out. So you combine them with a get or put, and man, you can express any motion imaginable. And we got angry, and we got in, and we got out, and we got to eat. So that's why what makes interpreting into English so much easier, because of these generalizations that you can go. But if you're going the other way around, what has happened to me many times is the speaker is going and they use generic terms. There's this joke that one pastor told me about, like when you're, this is actually maybe not the same thing, but similar things happen to me. One pastor goes, speaking through an interpreter, he goes, I have a German shepherd. And the interpreter says, у меня есть немецкий пастор. Okay, do you see how many ways this can end as a disaster, right? Every time I come home, he sits there and waits for me. Каждый раз прихожу, он ждет меня. And the interpreter is thinking, man, what a pastor. Whew. As soon as I open the door, he runs into the house in front of me. Только я открываю дверь, он забегает в дом. And everyone is sitting there like, what is going on? What is this pastor? And then when I sit down and I take off my shoes, he licks my feet. So sometimes you have to go through 4, 5, 6 phrases until you learn that, oh my gosh, phrase number 1, I interpreted that wrong. Because of generalization term, there's a generic verb in there or something with double meaning. And sometimes it goes through few phrases until you're like, well, something is not making sense here. And then finally they get to phrase number 6 or 7 and you're like, wow, this is what they meant. So then you have to go back and quickly correct yourself, because the audience is sitting there and they're like, what? And then you quickly have to, like, on the last phrase, say, это была немецкая овчарка. And then the audience kind of laughs and it becomes a joke, and the speaker is like not sure what's going on, but if they don't understand the language. But so that's the challenge with going from English to Russian. But generally, that challenge doesn't exist going from Russian to English. Russian language is more capable of conveying emotions and expressing human misery. There's so many words for grief in Russian language. So many variations. In English, it's like grief, sorrow, tragedy, sadness, and maybe a few more that people commonly use. I'm sure if you go to poetry, you can find a ton more that most of us never heard of. But in Russian, I mean, the variety and unthinkable variation of those words is huge. So when someone is standing in a funeral or just in front of church and they're expressing sympathies and condolences, it's sometimes very challenging to find all them synonyms, because they can go on and on and on listing different synonyms for grief, and you're like, I'm running out of the grief and sorrow. So that is the challenge, because Russian is very capable. However, English is much better equipped for science, technology, and sports. The nice thing about maybe in the last 10 to 20 years, There's been a ton. Russian has changed so dramatically. When I listen to modern Russian now, they have adapted so many English modern words that it's making interpretation a lot easier. Like, oh, it's a smiley. It's a smile, it's like on the face, on the smile. It's, oh, it's a emoji. Oh, it's a selfie. And you're like, okay, so but science, technology, medical terms, all of that, computer terminology, all the internet terms, they have sort of became interchangeable. So that made it easier. So because Russian didn't really have a lot of these science and technical terms. Like, for example, when the computers came out, 60s, back in those vacuum transistors and stuff, the Russian language did not have the word for computer. In fact, in English, it was a new word too. It's a computing machine. It computes stuff. It calculates things. So, I was going to school in Russia or Ukraine in late 80s and early 90s, and we didn't call things computer. While here they would call things computer in America, we would call them EVM, электронно-вычислительная машина, electronically calculating machine. That was the word for computer. No one uses the word EVM anymore. It's all computer. So that term has been adapted, and it's true for a lot of terms. So that's, in that way, it's nice to be able to understand things in English because a lot of your professional technology, science, and all that terms have been adapted. All right. So that's kind of the basic intro into interpretation. So next Wednesday, we're going to go right into the meat of the course, of the material, and we're going to start. And I'm going to assign homework today already. I'm going to give you, and when we're done, I want to go through and make sure you guys have access. I'm going to put you into the Google Drive. I want to make sure you have. Yep. All right, so there's 3 assignments. So there are 2 messages there, 1 and 2. Listen to the first 5 and then interpret each one of them and record 1 into English, 1 into Russian. For this homework, you don't need to do, this is, the way you do it is you turn on the your phone and maybe an iPad and a computer, turn this on, video, hear a little bit, press pause, and then record. You can have your phone recording the whole time. So until you get to minute number 5, then you stop, you're done. All right? Later on, maybe a few lessons down the road, I'm going to expect you to be doing that in simultaneous mode. Like as you don't hit pauses, you keep on going. But in the beginning first, until you get comfortable with it, it's called consecutive interpretation. You hit pause, you interpret, then keep on going again. So record it in your voice recorder, and you can submit that. I'm going to share that with you right now. There's a folder called Homework Submissions. You only have access to folder with except for me, your homework submissions. So this is the secret to really take the best out of this class is doing those homework submissions. People who did them, improved dramatically. And then memorization number 3, first 10 words in terms, and then Psalm 1 and 23.
So you want us to interpret the first one into English, and the second one into Russian?
Correct.
Okay.
First 5 minutes of each. And then these 2 messages, that's going to be a continuous exercise for the duration of this class. Then it's going to be next 5 minutes, and next 5 minutes, and next 5 minutes, and so on.
So the 5-minute mark of the video.
Yeah. So we're going to go in 5 minutes. Every week, you're going to interpret 5 minutes of the. You'll see when you go to that where homework, all these homework assignments, they are in folders. There's homework 1, 2, 3. I think it goes through 6 or 7 homework assignments. When you open the first one, there's going to be a Word document listing, giving you these links, so you don't have to really type them in. And also, I recorded simultaneous interpretation of both of them. And once you're done doing your 5 minutes, you can listen to how I did it, just to make yourself feel bad or something. I don't know. No, it wasn't that good. Because these are not easy. There's a lot of jokes in there and stuff, and at least on George W. Duke part.
Yeah. Do you want us to use like enthusiasm?
Yeah. You gotta use the emotion as much as you can.
Locked in my room.
Don't expect yourself to do well the first time, all right? Especially if you've never done it before or have limited exposure to this. Once we proceed, you'll see yourself doing better and better. You may not even see it. I'll notice it. I mean, I know for sure. And then by the week 10, you'll be able to do at least the Russian to English fairly well, at least on 80% level. 80%, that's already presentable in church. So, That's a B. That's a solid B minus. First time you're gonna do it, it's gonna be a solid F. All right, but we'll get you to that B minus level. Some of you will get to A plus. It really depends on your vocab, your understanding of Russian, and just generally, some people are better at words than others. Now, in church setting, we don't use that many words. Okay, luckily. Maybe as the preacher is preaching, he'll use 1,000 words at most. And we probably use about 100 to 200 different phrases interchangeably, biblical phrases. Once you get to interpret so much, you'll hear every single one of those phrases, and pretty much most interpretation you can do without really focusing on interpretation. Then you can focus on emotions, you can focus on your actions, all the things we're going to talk about next class. So at first it's difficult, but once you go through all those 1,000 words and 100 some phrases that people commonly use in church, it becomes like redemption, salvation. So like a lot of these words, the common terms that we have on here on this list, they will become second nature really fast. All right. So let me just